Bueno, buenas tardes. Reanudamos los trabajos de la Comisión de Recursos Naturales, Ambientales y Reciclaje de la Cámara de Representantes. En la tarde de hoy nos acompaña vía Zoom Centro Caribeño de Asuntos del Nivel del Mar con el arquitecto Fernando Pavón y John England. Y tenemos los miembros del Comité de Cambio Climático aquí mediante la plataforma Zoom. Vamos a empezar con el arquitecto Fernando Pavón y luego con John Engler. Adelante, compañero, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, honorable representante Feliciano, honorables miembros de la Comisión Conjunta sobre Mitigación, Adaptación y Resiliencia al Cambio Climático de la Asamblea Legislativa del Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, distinguidos miembros del Comité de Expertos y Asesores del Cambio Climático y distinguidos invitados. Muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Fernando Pavón Rico, Tecnología e Investigación de Puerto Rico, en colaboración con el Rising Seas Institute. Nuestra misión es preparar a Puerto Rico y el Caribe para que se adapten y progresen en la nueva era del creciente riesgo de inundaciones por tormentas, mareas y aumento del nivel del mar. Este nuevo programa definirá aún más el liderazgo y el posicionamiento de Puerto Rico como centro de excelencia e innovación. El centro fue creado por un conjunto de expertos mundiales bajo el liderato y guía del profesor. El señor John Englander es un oceanógrafo de reconocimiento global y autor de varios libros populares y que son una autoridad en la materia. El pasado verano leí su más reciente libro, Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. Desde mi punto de vista como arquitecto y urbanista, conocedor de las complejidades que nacen de la intersección entre los fenómenos naturales y las actividades del ser humano, me sorprendió la lectura sencilla y a la vez profunda de lo que significará el efecto del aumento del nivel del mar en el futuro de los asentamientos humanos y la vida diaria. La experiencia del señor Englander debió alertarme. Algunos de ustedes recordarán al señor Jacques Cousteau, famoso oceanógrafo y líder mundial en la educación sobre los océanos. Poco antes de morir, designó al señor Englander como presidente de su organización, reconociendo la amenaza de cambio climático y la necesidad de manera clara. Con esa experiencia, a mi parecer, el mensaje del señor Englander es clave en preparar al mundo para un aspecto crucial del cambio climático. Este es el aumento en el nivel del mar. El profesor Englander presentará en inglés. Es un placer presentarles a la distinguida autoridad en el aumento del nivel del mar, el profesor John Englander.
Thank you, Fernando.
Adelante.
Honorable Chairman Feliciano, honorable members of the Climate Change Commission, and members of the Expert Committee on Climate Change. Thank you for this invitation. Puerto Rico is very familiar with flooding. Perhaps you recall Ocean Park, Luisa, or Ponce Playa flooded. Perhaps you saw news of water covering streets and entering buildings in Condado, Caño Martin Peña, and Cantano. Flooding comes in many forms, which are often confused. As we enter this new era of climate change, it is essential that we look at several separate aspects of flooding, as each poses a different challenge and requires a type of flooding we do not have experience with yet, the permanent flooding from sea level rise. It's imperative that we understand the future of rising sea level so that we can adapt for it while there is still time. In Puerto Rico, there are abundant examples of buildings and infrastructure that have been in use for centuries. 100 years is a useful reference point to ensure that our assets have long, durable lives and produce good returns on investment. As a good example, your Capitol building was finished 93 years ago. Unfortunately, many assets and items of infrastructure will see their useful lives shortened greatly. Sea level will rise faster and faster for centuries. This is due to the extra heat that is already stored in the ocean, resulting from the additional carbon dioxide, CO2, that has been emitted over the last 2 centuries. from the burning of fossil fuels. But make no mistake, despite all the efforts to reduce emissions, we put more carbon dioxide in the air every year. As a result, the oceans are more than 2 degrees warmer than 200 years ago, and we are on track to double that warming this century. It's very important to understand rising sea level as a special aspect of ocean issues, environment, and the challenges of climate change. In fact, surprisingly, sea level is more of a land issue than it is an ocean issue. When sea level is 5 feet higher, it will have a modest impact on the sea, but it will have a profound. It affects our homes, businesses, infrastructure, and communities. Globally, some 30 countries will effectively disappear underwater over the next century or so. On this slide, we see that looking back to the last ice age, some 20,000 years ago, sea level was 390 feet lower. It's almost unimaginable. To give you an idea of what this means, that is roughly twice the height of the Banco Popular building in Adore. During the last rapid rise, as the ice sheets melted just 14,000 years ago, a blink in geologic time, sea level 15 feet per century, as shown by the 3 blue arrows. Back then, the coastline would have been very different. You could have walked to Vieques and the US Virgin Islands. As sea level rises, the shoreline moves far inland. As a point of reference, we need to note that the last time sea level was higher than present was 122,000 years ago, as shown on this bottom graphic. That was during the previous ice age cycle. And then sea level rose 25 feet above the present. Imagine that. In 6,000 years, stable sea level misled us into thinking that sea level and shorelines are permanent. They have been constantly changing. When the planet is warmer, there is less polar ice and higher sea level. The opposite is true too. And there's more ice sheets, there's lower sea level. Looking at this graph, which we will share with your commission and committee, it depicts 400,000 years of sea level, shown in the lower line in blue. In red is global average temperature. We can see there's a natural pattern to temperature change and sea level over geologic time. They rise, it's a roughly 100,000 year cycle. They rise for about 20,000 years and then fall for about 80,000 years. The recent stable sea level rise, or stable sea level period of 6,000 years, was the turning point from the rising phase to the falling phase, a natural cycle. But note that the top line, the green line, which shows carbon dioxide, also follows the same path over centuries and thousands of years, move in long-term synchronization. But the vertical green line in the upper right, carbon dioxide, is moving straight upward on the graph. Temperature and sea level are following, but they respond slowly with a lag time. It will take centuries for them to come back into alignment, created by Professor John Tyndall in London over a century ago. Yet the obvious question is, why did the ice age temperatures move up and down millions of years before we burned fossil fuels? Of course, the ice age cycles of the last 2.5 million years were natural. They were caused by a solar cycle known as the Milankovitch. According to that, we should be entering the cooling period. But here is the fact that is often missed. Even if every nation stopped burning fossil fuels immediately, sea level will still rise for centuries. Just as a body in motion requires time to arrive at a full stop, the planet's warming temperature, melting ice sheets, rising sea level, and changing coastlines will take a long time to restabilize. We have already warmed the oceans over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. This trend is not slowing down. The ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland are melting faster and faster, causing global sea level to rise towards levels never experienced in human civilization. This is foreign to us. Because sea level rise is unstoppable, we must start designing, constructing, and adapting our buildings, infrastructure, and communities for sea level to rise more than 10 feet in the next century or so. The climate change problem is really three separate issues: sustainability, resiliency, and adaptation. The first is sustainability. We think of as to slow the warming, we must reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. But it's the global total that makes the difference, not the emissions of local communities. So the challenge to produce the world's energy needs without making the planet warmer is huge, and a perfect example of the question of sustainability, being able to do something without degrading the situation. Resiliency, kind of my second aspect of climate change, is very distinct. Because the world is warmer and weather patterns are changing, we are seeing more wildfires, more deluge rainfall, and more severe droughts altogether every year. We must design to be more resilient, to minimize damage during those events. Because same as preparing for future sea level rise. We are collaborating with international expert organizations such as the Global Resiliency Institute. While these two issues are extremely important, sustainability and resiliency, adaptation, because sea level rise is unstoppable. The adaptation to future sea level is quite different from reducing emissions and increasing sustainability and being more resilient. It requires planning for a future that we have never experienced as a civilization. As an added benefit, adapting will improve our resiliency to future events of flooding. But this is the legacy we must create for future generations to prepare for the future. The rate of sea level rise is increasing rapidly. It's accelerating and rising even faster. The rate has almost doubled in a mere 20 years. It's tripled in 30 years. As we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, a change in rate can compound very quickly and surprise us. It is very hard for us to imagine and plan for exponential growth, whether it's a pandemic or the melting of the enormous ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland. As shown in this graphic, last century sea level was rising at about 1.5 millimeters a year as a global average. Very, very small. But then it doubled to over 3 millimeters a year in the last 30 years. Now it's almost 5 millimeters a year. The rate has tripled in 30 years, and it's accelerating even faster. Remember, it has happened before, looking back at geologic history, even without the added warming due to the burning of fossil fuels and other activities stemming from the Industrial Revolution. Combined with the knowledge that the rate of rise has exceeded 15 feet in a century, the responsible thing to do now is to start planning while there is time to adapt. We cannot know for certain how fast sea level will rise. That depends on how warm we make the planet, which depends on what the world does with greenhouse gas emissions, which depends on how we make the energy, not just in Puerto Rico, but globally. To slow the ice melting, we must stop the warming. But even if just 5% of the ice melts, sea level will be 10 feet higher globally. That is why 10 feet higher sea level is our recommended safe planning target, looking forward to 100 years. Even if we manage to get the other 95% ice from melting, we still need to accommodate 10 feet of higher sustained sea level as a baseline. The Caribbean Center for Rising Seas is particularly interested to work with architects, engineers, planners, economists, and others who can be on the front lines of adapting in advance of rising seas. The nature of this work will take many forms, including redefining professional knowledge and accepted practices for those specialties. We will work with them to understand sea level rise so they can amend key regulations such as building codes, zoning, and authorized land use. Urban and rural development culture and practices will need to change. Adaptation actions include the development of educational tools, research to identify, produce, or improve regulatory and structural techniques, and encouraging practical pilot applications in all three areas of education. To conclude, I want to explain why I chose Puerto Rico for this pioneering effort. There are three primary reasons. First, the Puerto Rico Science Trust and its leadership appreciated the potential impact of sea level rising and its importance to the island's economic development and the citizens' well-being, and is committed to support this program. The Science Trust also convened key players to be part of an advisory board, including professional associations of architects, landscape architects, engineers, and surveyors. The second reason that Puerto Rico was the ideal place to base this institute is that Puerto Rico is high elevation, extending hundreds, even a few thousand feet above sea level. Even 10 feet of sea level rise would leave about 94% of the current land area above water. Old San Juan and most of the 78 urban centers will. This is in sharp contrast to many popular coastal places in the world that will be fully underwater with just 10 feet of sea level rise, quite sadly. Due to high elevation, Puerto Rico has a future. Third reason that I'm delighted to start this center, Caribbean Center for Rising Seas in Puerto Rico. Million people, strong universities, and a sophisticated professional workforce, you have the basic skills and capacity to learn and innovate ways to cope with rising sea level. Also, with a culture that goes back centuries, you understand the value of planning for the long term. And finally, you are survivors, having endured many natural and in recent years. The bottom line is that Puerto Rico is ideally positioned to plan for future sea level rise, while it is still recovering from storms such as Hurricane Maria and planning for future storms. Planning for rising sea level presents Puerto Rico with a strategic opportunity. You can not only survive, you can thrive. You can take a page from the book of your ancestors and seize the day to plan for economic development on safe, higher ground. Security about future planning requirements for changes in sea level and shoreline can improve the safety and stability of property values and attract people from all walks of life to stay in Puerto Rico and to return, benefiting generations to come. The Caribbean Center for Rising Seas team looks forward to working with all of you on this commission, with the Committee of Experts and Advisors, the National Climate Assessment, the government, universities, private sector, nonprofit entities. This is a collaborative effort. We also want Puerto Rico to be a regional leader, an example for the U.S. Virgin Islands and the wider Caribbean. This pioneering program of the Puerto Rico Science Trust can attract people from all over the world to learn from what you do here in the years and decades to come. Again, thank you for this opportunity to testify in front of this honorable commission. The Caribbean Center for Rising Seas looks forward to working with you